This is a review of the contributions from a research synthesis titled Improving Reading Outcomes for Students with or at Risk for Reading Disabilities, a synthesis of the contributions from the Institute of Education Sciences Research Centers by Connor, Alberto, Compton, and O'Connor, 2014. In this research synthesis, the authors reviewed the results of the first 8 years of Institute of Education, IES-funded research. They discussed research on preventing and remediating reading difficulties, and they provided important reading instruction research results to guide theory and practice based on IES-funded studies. IES-funded research has made contributions to research questions regarding teaching reading. Their projects have helped to identify students who may need additional reading support before they develop reading challenges. IES-funded research has also identified critical component skills that support proficient reading, such as phonological awareness, word knowledge, and working memory. They have developed and tested interventions and included students with disabilities in their research. IES-funded research investigated ways to bring effective interventions into classrooms. Research funded by IES has developed and evaluated professional development training that focuses on educating teachers about how to teach reading skills effectively to all students. IES-funded reading research was organized into the following categories: assessment, basic cognitive and linguistic processes, intervention, and professional development. In each of these areas, they developed research questions to be answered by reviewing the reading research. A panel of scholars reviewed 111 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters that were products of 48 research projects focused on improving reading for children with or at risk for reading disabilities, funded by IES research grants. They looked at both empirical studies and theoretical pieces and determined what had been learned and where empirical and theoretical progress had been made as a result of IES-funded reading research. They looked at research on programs, practices, and policies that are intended to improve outcomes for students with or at risk for reading disabilities. Studies looking at typically developing readers were not included in this synthesis. This is also not an overview of all the existing research on improving reading for children with or at risk for reading disabilities because the focus is only on IES-funded research. This research synthesis looks at 4 domains: assessment, basic cognitive and linguistic processes, intervention, and professional development. Within these 4 domains, the researchers identified 15 contributions to understanding how to best support students with disabilities in reading and students at risk for reading disabilities. So the first research question that they asked was, what have we learned about effective identification and assessment of students who have or are at risk for reading difficulties or disabilities? Contribution 1 is universal screening. Correct identification of students who are at risk for developing reading disabilities in preschool through 1st grade can lead to early intervention that can place students on the path to typical reading development and success. Universal screening at the beginning of the school year can be a valid and efficient way to identify students who may struggle learning to read. Contribution 2 was using assessments to monitor progress. Progress monitoring is a way to gauge students' progress, and response to intervention is one model where progress monitoring assessments are used to make decisions regarding levels of support that students require to be successful with reading. 2 progress monitoring measures that IES looked at for indexing and monitoring 1st grade reading development were word identification fluency and nonsense word fluency. Evidence from IES research indicates that word identification fluency is well suited as a screening and progress monitoring measure that can be used to make accurate decisions using an RTI model. Contribution 3 was in the area of valid assessments for English learners. Many English language learners are at a serious risk for developing reading disabilities, but these students are more difficult to accurately identify. It is sometimes difficult to determine if English language learners have real reading challenges or if the difficulties are related instead to learning a new language. IES has investigated in researching alternative assessments for students with limited English proficiency to be used when these students are evaluated for a suspected reading disability and for progress monitoring. Students with limited English proficiency can be misclassified as having reading disabilities when they do not, and this is a violation of their rights protected under IDEA. IES looked into ways to help support alternative assessments for students who are learning English. From the IES-funded research, it was found that reading comprehension can be accurately assessed without overburdening word reading and oral language skills. The diagnostic assessment of reading comprehension has the potential to accurately reflect English language learners' comprehension skills. Contribution 4 is in the area of evaluation of testing accommodations for students with disabilities. The challenge with effectively assessing students with disabilities is developing accessible tests that measure only the essential parts of reading proficiency and not characteristics that could be related to students' disabilities. One of the areas of focus of IES research has been on examining the appropriate accommodations for students with disabilities and the effects of these use of these accommodations on test scores. Results of one study suggest that a read aloud accommodation, where students listen to rather than read text, represents an accommodation as opposed to a modification for students with reading disabilities. Providing large print and braille accommodations to students with visual impairments was also assessed as an accommodation, and it was determined that these are valid accommodations for students with visual impairments. Another study looked at the types of reading texts used on assessments and determined that creating motivating assessments with interesting passages was positively correlated with reading performance, especially for lower performing students. Finally, IES research looked at the characteristics of students for whom reading assessments are less valid and reliable, and they determined that students who tend to have globally slow processing, very poor decoding skills, and exceptional difficulty staying on task are not as accurately measured by reading assessments. The next question they asked was in the area of basic cognitive and linguistic processes. And they asked, what are the basic cognitive and linguistic processes that support successful reading, and how can these skills be improved for students who have or who are at risk for reading disabilities? As an important contribution of IES funding has been to provide support for research that looks into the underlying processes and mechanisms of reading. Through this research, they have identified key components of reading, such as word knowledge and working memory, and to the extent these processes can be changed in students who struggle with reading. The IES-funded research has focused on research that seeks to understand whether changes in how children learn to read might lead to changes in their reading outcomes. These studies have focused on enactive representation, oddity, seriation and conservation, working memory and coherent mental representations, and higher-order cognitive processes. Contribution number 5 from IES-funded research on basic cognitive and linguistic processes is in the area of basic cognitive processes. Working memory is an area that has been reviewed by IES-funded research, and there is evidence from cognitive literature to suggest that children who have difficulty comprehending what they read often have less working memory capacity than do children who do not have comprehension difficulties. Short-term memory and working memory share some underlying components such as processing speed and updating. According to IES-funded research on students with disabilities and students with low comprehension, children with reading disabilities had less storage capacity or short-term memory than did children who only had comprehension deficits and did not have reading disabilities. Another IES-funded meta-analysis revealed that students and adults with reading disabilities performed more poorly on tests of working and short-term memory than did typical readers. Stronger working memory and short-term memory are both associated with skilled reading. Students with stronger working memory skills and stronger comprehension skills and short-term memory skills were associated with decoded and word reading. Contribution number 6 was in the area of oral language skills and vocabulary, and oral language and vocabulary contribute to children's reading performance and are malleable or changeable linguistic processes. IES-funded research suggests that interventions that focus on word knowledge might be effective in improving reading comprehension if they focus on developing both wide and deep word knowledge. The researchers also looked at the vocabulary skills of students who spoke Spanish at home and English at school and found that having strong Spanish vocabulary and narrative skills helped with narrative skills in English and reading comprehension. Contribution 7 is in the area of cognitive and linguistic skill differences in children. Children bring unique constellations of cognitive and linguistic skills to the classroom. Although the same set of cognitive and linguistic skills are required to read, children come to school with a variety of strengths and weaknesses. IES-funded research looked at preschool studies, elementary studies, and adolescent studies of reading performance and found that students continue to struggle with reading into middle school. All students bring a unique set of skills with them to the classroom, and a method of instruction that might work for one student may not be able to reach all students. So there is still a need for research to find what is the best way to meet the needs of all students and how to individualize for students. The next research question that they asked was, how do we make reading instruction more effective for students who have or are at risk for developing reading disabilities? How do we teach reading to students with low incidence disabilities? So contribution number 8 was in the area of, from IES-supported research, implies that increasing the intensity of interventions in kindergarten and first grade may prevent future reading difficulties for many students. The studies funded by IES in this area contribute to the literature in this area demonstrating providing intensive intervention to students with low reading skills in kindergarten and first grade generally improves reading outcomes later on. English language learners benefited from early intervention that provided one-on-one phonics instruction, and they outperformed English language learners who received kindergarten without the intervention. Students with behavior problems also benefited from early intervention that focused on explicit, systematic, code-based reading instruction and outperformed control groups that did not receive a systematic intervention that included phonics. Contribution 9 is in the area of fluency interventions. Fluency interventions that focus on repeated reading or reading a range of text, along with opportunities to practice reading in the classroom, may generally improve students' fluency and comprehension. Fluency interventions in several studies improve students' vocabulary and comprehension scores. Researchers also found that well-trained paraeducators can deliver fluency interventions effectively, which can save school districts money and also assist teachers. Fluency interventions for students with reading disabilities can take a long time to have an effect, but 2 IES-funded studies found little fluency effects from a fluency intervention, but they did notice other positive impacts of the fluency intervention, such as increases in reading comprehension, and they determined that it just may take longer for the fluency interventions to be able to show that educational impact. Fluency gains do not appear to influence decoding or vocabulary. Students with slow reading rate will need specific instruction in decoding and vocabulary that should continue into the intermediate grades. Contribution 10 was in the area of oral language interventions. Language outcomes for many preschool children at risk for language disabilities can benefit from extensive opportunities to hear and use complex oral language. Children's use of oral language is a positive predictor of reading development throughout schooling. Research with preschool has found that children who are at risk for language disabilities are also at risk of developing reading disabilities. Typically, developing children frequently learn new vocabulary incidentally, but students with disabilities or at risk for disabilities are likely to need more intensive and extended instruction to learn the same core words as typically developing students. Extended vocabulary instruction has had a positive effect on children's ability to provide definitions of words and is more effective than general classroom instruction. Contribution 11 is in the area of peer-assisted learning strategies. Peer-assisted or collaborative learning strategies are promising methods for improving students' reading outcomes. With IES support, a group of researchers looked at 20 years of research on peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS, and found that PALS was generally effective in improving reading outcomes, including for high-poverty students in high-poverty schools. Considering all the studies, students in classes that used PALS outperformed students in traditional classrooms. But 20% of low-achieving students and over 50% of students with disabilities failed to make improvements in reading when they were provided with the peer tutor. Of the students who did not benefit from peer tutoring, 50% did benefit when the tutoring was provided by a trained adult, which shows so that the peer tutoring may not work for everybody, but it is effective for some students, maybe not for students with disabilities, though, all the time. Contribution 12 was in the area of differentiated instruction. Differentiated or individualized instruction can improve reading development. Interventions that are targeted to an individual student profile of component skills can be helpful. One differentiated reading instruction intervention was supported by IES, was called IES Student Instruction. Based on individual student profiles, recommendations were made for each student. In the study of ISI, the students in the ISI classrooms demonstrated generally stronger word reading and comprehension gains than students in control classrooms. This research builds upon the previous work that indicates a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching reading is likely to fail many students. Contribution 13 was in the area of children with low-incidence disabilities. How typically developing readers learn to read also appears to hold for students with low-incidence disabilities, including children with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities, children with autism, and children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Phonological awareness was significantly correlated with vocabulary knowledge and reading achievement in a 2010 descriptive study conducted with a group of students with mild intellectual disabilities who were struggling to learn how to read. Students with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities can learn basic reading skills if they are given consistent, explicit, and comprehensive reading instruction across an extended period of time. The amount of time required for these students is generally substantially longer than for typically developing students. An IES-funded study of students who were deaf and hard of hearing found that they were delayed in phonological awareness and phonics skills compared to their typically developing peers, but that they were able to learn phonics skills and develop phonological awareness in preschool and kindergarten. The IES research has determined that with systematic and intensive intervention, students that struggle with reading can make substantial gains. The next question that the researchers asked was, how do we bring research-based instructional practices to the classroom with professional development? Teachers' delivery of complex evidence-based instruction and interventions can be improved through developing their specialized knowledge and supporting consistent long-term implementation of evidence-based instructional practices. IES-funded research looked at preschool teachers and Head Start programs and found that teachers with more education were more likely to improve their students' reading outcomes. Other IES-funded research looked at teachers' specialized knowledge of concepts of literacy and how to teach literacy and found that they could greatly improve teachers' knowledge of literacy by providing professional development. They were also able to improve teachers' attitudes about teaching reading by giving them the knowledge to teach reading more effectively, thereby improving their self-efficacy. Teachers that felt more capable at teaching reading and that felt they were making a difference with their students were more likely to keep using the strategies they were taught. Contribution 15 was in the area of combining multiple professional development strategies. Research has also shown that combining multiple professional development strategies, such as linking student assessment data to instruction, coaching, using technology, and participating in communities of practice, can support teachers' learning and implementation of research-based reading instruction. Multifaceted teacher professional development considers that teachers differ in their beliefs, their knowledge, and the support they receive from schools. IES-funded research has found that students made greater gains when their teachers received a professional development training called the Literacy Collaborative as compared to typical school practices. In this type of professional development opportunity, the teachers received trainings from research-trained literacy coaches that worked in their schools. The 4th and 5th grade teachers in this study saw improvements in their students' outcomes on the state-mandated reading test. So this IES research summary represented the work that has been done with IES funding in the areas of assessment, basic cognitive and linguistic processes, intervention, and professional development. Connor and her colleagues have provided an overview of current IES-funded research with students who are at risk for developing reading disabilities and students with reading disabilities. and they listed important findings that can guide classroom practices and future research for students with disabilities and students who are at risk. In the area of assessment for students at risk for and students with reading disabilities, the researchers provided support for screening all students at the beginning of the year, especially in the early grades. In the area of basic cognitive and linguistic processes, research has helped to identify processes that support successful reading. Several important cognitive processes contribute to children's reading performance, such as working memory, grasp of the principles of seriation and conservation, and abstract and inferential reasoning. Other skills, such as oral language skills and vocabulary, are malleable and can be taught to students to improve their reading performance. Children also bring unique patterns of strengths and weaknesses to the classroom, and this affects how they are impacted by instruction. In the area of intervention in the IES-funded studies, they found that increasing the intensity of instruction in kindergarten and first grade can prevent reading difficulties for many students, and they recommended that language delays can improve if preschoolers are provided with extensive opportunities to hear and use complex oral language. Students with disabilities benefit from the same reading strategies used with typically developing students. Teaching phonemic awareness and phonics is helpful for students with a range of special needs and behavioral issues. Individualizing instruction was also found to be important in order for students to benefit from instruction, and the researchers recommended instruction that is differentiated based on each child's needs. In the area of professional development, the researchers wanted to find out the best way to bring research-based instructional methods to the classrooms. Professional development that combines approaches such as coaching, using student data to drive instruction, using technology to improve instruction, and participating in communities of practice can support teachers' learning and implementation of effective instruction. Research in the future should build upon these 15 recommendations, and teachers can consider these recommendations when working with students who are struggling with reading and students with disabilities.